The Galactic Warlords did not conquer the universe overnight. Their rule was forged in blood, destruction, and a ruthless belief that might was the only law worth following. The galaxy had once been filled with thousands of thriving civilizations, each with its own customs, technologies, and ways of life. That changed when the Warlords emerged. At first, they were nothing more than war bands, pirates, mercenaries, and rogue military factions left unchecked in the aftermath of interstellar conflicts. But as their numbers grew, so did their ambition. They saw weakness in the scattered empires and federations that had governed the galaxy for millennia. Rather than challenge each other, the strongest among them forged an alliance, agreeing to divide the galaxy among themselves. It was not a peaceful arrangement, but it worked, bound by the unspoken rule that no species, no matter how advanced, would ever stand against them. The most feared among them included General Zalvor of the Drakthor, a reptilian brute whose forces thrived on shock and out tactics, the insected hive queen, Sithrex, whose biomechanical legions stripped planets down to their very crust, and Supreme Warlord Varkis, a towering juggernaut with a neural interface that linked him to every fleet under his command. Each warlord brought their own brand of terror, ensuring that no rebellion could ever gain momentum. Entire planets were wiped out as examples, species deemed unworthy were exterminated, and those who surrendered were forced into servitude, their cultures erased and rewritten to serve the warlords' rule. Over time, they became the unchallenged overlords of the known galaxy, their names whispered in terror. Yet, amid their reign of fear, there was one species they never considered a true threat: humans. Humanity had once been an ambitious species, known for their adaptability and ingenuity. But in the eyes of the warlords, they lacked the raw power necessary to be a dominant force. While they were clever, their technology was primitive compared to the hyper-advanced war machines of the Drakthor or the swarm intelligence of the Sithrex hive. When the warlords arrived in human space, there was barely a fight. Earth's fleets were decimated in a matter of days, its colonies reduced to ruins within weeks. Those who survived were either enslaved or scattered across the fringes of the galaxy, their homeworld left as a reminder of what happened to those who defied the warlords. To them, humanity was nothing more than another footnote in their conquest. Their mistake was assuming that humans, once beaten, would stay beaten. The first sign of trouble came when one of their own was found dead on the bridge of his warship. Supreme Tactician Ralthun had been one of the most feared strategists in the warlords' ranks, known for orchestrating planetary sieges with surgical precision. His forces had never known defeat. But that night, something impossible happened. Ralthun was assassinated. His guards were still at their posts, his security system still active. And yet there he was, slumped in his command chair with a single blade buried in his throat. Panic spread through the ranks of the warlords. Assassination was not a tactic used against them. Their enemies were always too weak, too scattered, too afraid. Yet, here was undeniable proof that someone had infiltrated the unbreachable and slain one of their own. At first, they suspected an internal betrayal. But analysis of the crime scene revealed something no one had expected: traces of human DNA. The idea was almost laughable. A human? Killing a warlord? Even if one had somehow survived long enough to seek revenge, it was unthinkable that they could breach the security of one of the most heavily guarded warships in the fleet. And yet, the evidence was undeniable. The warlords responded with swift brutality. A bounty was placed on all humans, regardless of allegiance. Any found within their territory would be executed on sight. Entire spaceports were searched, entire sectors purged, in a desperate attempt to root out the assassin. But the warlords, for all their power, were about to learn something they had never considered before. Fear, the very tool they had wielded for so long, was now being used against them. Somewhere out in the dark, a human was hunting them. And one by one they would fall. Daniel Kane had been dead for a long time. At least, that's what the warlords believed. When Earth fell, its last defenders scattered like ashes in the wind, and Kane had been among them, a nameless soldier lost in the chaos of war. His unit had been annihilated, his family slaughtered, and everything he had fought for reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale of resistance crushed beneath the heel of the warlords. But Cain wasn't dead. He had survived, and survival had turned into something else, something colder, sharper, more relentless. Over the years, he had learned how to navigate the fringes of the galaxy, slipping between the cracks of warlord-controlled space, moving unseen where no human should be able to walk. He studied them, watched how they operated, how they thought, how they killed. And then, he started to kill them back. He wasn't a hero. Heroes died screaming in the dust of forgotten battlefields. Cain was something else entirely, an executioner, a shadow slipping through the warlord's ranks, a myth whispered in hushed voices by those who had seen his work. He had no army, no home, no cause beyond the one he had carved out for himself. His first target had been an experiment, a way to test the limits of what was possible. A single warlord, alone on his ship, with every advantage on his side. Cain had infiltrated the vessel, moving like a ghost through corridors lined with biometric scanners and surveillance drones. The kill had been clean, a blade to the throat, a whisper of a struggle, and then silence. He had left no message, no sign beyond a single drop of human blood where none should have been. Now, the hunt had begun. Cain's survival depended on his ability to stay ahead of those who hunted him, and for that, he relied on tools no human should have possessed. Over the years, he had scavenged, stolen, and modified alien technology, shaping it into something uniquely suited to his needs. His armor was a patchwork of different designs, blending the best elements of warlord shielding with the flexibility of human combat suits. It allowed him to move quickly, strike hard, and disappear before alarms could be raised. His weapons were even more dangerous. The plasma blade strapped to his back was of warlord origin, but heavily modified, its energy output unstable, its edge sharp enough to cut through the reinforced hull of a starship. His sidearm, a compact particle disruptor, was designed for silent kills, disintegrating targets without leaving a trace. And then there were his more unconventional tools, hacked security chips that let him pass through biometric scanners, a neural dampener that masked his presence from psychic warlords, and a cloaking module stolen from a fallen enemy, allowing him to vanish in plain sight. But his greatest weapon wasn't something he could carry. It was the fear he created. The warlords were not used to being afraid. They had ruled with such absolute power for so long that the idea of being hunted was unthinkable. Cain changed that. He didn't just kill them, he made them question their own invincibility. He left messages behind, written in old Earth languages they couldn't understand but knew were meant for them. He struck at moments when they felt safest, in places they believed untouchable. He whispered war philosophies from humanity's long-forgotten past, reminders that no empire, no matter how powerful, could rule forever. His name was never spoken in their ranks, but they all knew it. They called him the Ghost, and the paranoia he spread was worth more than any weapon he carried. That first kill had been deliberate. The warlords needed to know what was coming. The second had been faster, more brutal, an execution in the middle of a heavily guarded compound. The victim had been a high-ranking commander, surrounded by his elite guards. Cain had walked into the heart of their fortress, past all their defenses, and taken the commander's head before vanishing into the night. By the time the warlords understood what was happening, it was already too late. He was inside their empire, moving unseen, striking where they least expected. And he was just getting started. The warlords had ruled without fear for centuries, but now fear had found them. The death of Supreme Tactician Ralthun was only the beginning. More warlords began to fall, their deaths seemingly impossible, their security measures useless against an enemy they couldn't see. The most powerful beings in the galaxy were being hunted, and for the first time in their existence, they felt vulnerable. Enraged, the warlords unleashed their full might to find the assassin. They deployed their most elite hunters, creatures bred for tracking and extermination, equipped with technology that could detect even the faintest biological traces. Cain's presence had turned their paranoia into a galaxy-wide manhunt. Every known human settlement was burned to the ground. Every outpost was raided. millions of innocent lives were sacrificed in the warlord's desperation to draw him out. But Cain did not take the bait. He remained a ghost, slipping through their fingers as he continued his work. The more they hunted him, the more he used their own fear against them. False leads, misleading transmissions, and strategic kills in seemingly random locations kept them guessing. He disrupted their supply chains, sabotaged their communication networks, and forced them to spread their forces thinner and thinner. The harder they pushed, the weaker they became. Still, they refused to believe that one human could be responsible for this. It had to be an organized effort, a hidden rebellion, another empire backing him from the shadows. They interrogated and tortured those they suspected of aiding him, but no one had any answers. There was no rebellion. No empire. Just one man with a grudge. Then came an unexpected shift. Cain wasn't the only one who wanted the warlords dead. Arik Kor had once been one of them, a brilliant strategist who had helped expand the warlords' empire through ruthless military campaigns. But betrayal among warlords was inevitable, and Kor had found himself on the losing end of a political struggle. His fleet was seized, his title stripped, and his people scattered to the winds. He should have died. He should have accepted his fate. Instead, he vanished. When Cain first encountered Kor, it was not as an enemy, but as something far more dangerous, an equal. Kor had been watching Cain, studying his tactics, piecing together how a single human had managed to cripple the warlords from within. He didn't see Cain as a threat. He saw an opportunity. Cain had no interest in allies. He worked alone, not because of arrogance, but because trusting anyone meant exposing a weakness. Yet Kor offered something too valuable to ignore: information. He knew how the warlords thought, how they moved, how they planned. More importantly, he knew where they would be next. The two made a reluctant deal. Kor would provide intelligence, and in return, Cain would ensure that the warlords who had betrayed him paid in blood. With Kor's knowledge, Cain's attacks became even deadlier. They no longer struck at random. They were precise, calculated. High-ranking warlords who had once been untouchable now found themselves backed into corners with nowhere to run. Their empire, built on absolute control, was unraveling from within. But with greater risk came greater danger. Cain had never made a mistake before. He couldn't afford to. His survival depended on staying ahead, on knowing what was coming before it arrived. Yet, for all his skill, he wasn't invincible. The mission should have been simple: another warlord, another strike in the dark. But something felt off from the moment he infiltrated the target's fortress. The defenses were too lax. The guards too predictable. Everything fell into place too easily. He knew it was a trap before he even saw them. The warlords had learned. They had adapted. And for the first time since the hunt had begun, Cain found himself the hunted. The ambush was brutal. A dozen warlord enforcers, armed with weapons designed to counter everything they knew about him. Cain fought like hell, his instincts keeping him alive as he tore through them, but he was outnumbered. Outgunned. A plasma bolt caught him in the side, burning through armor and flesh. He gritted his teeth and kept moving, forcing his body past the pain. Another shot grazed his shoulder, sending him staggering into cover. He wasn't going to make it out. Then, Kor made his move. The rogue strategist had never intended to fight. He was a planner, not a soldier. But when he saw Cain trapped, he made a choice that went against every calculated instinct he had. He created a diversion, setting off a controlled explosion that tore through the fortress's eastern wing. In the chaos, Cain seized his chance, disappearing into the smoke. The warlords had come closer than ever to killing him. They had seen him, wounded him. For the first time, they had a real confirmation of the assassin's existence. They thought they had gained the upper hand. They were wrong. Cain had survived. And now, it was personal. Fear was a powerful thing. For centuries, the warlords had wielded it like a weapon, using it to break empires and silence rebellions before they could even begin. But now, for the first time, they were the ones looking over their shoulders. Cain's survival wasn't just a victory for himself, it was a symbol. A message. If a single human could slip through their defenses, kill their most powerful leaders, and escape alive, then maybe the warlords weren't as untouchable as they had always believed. The cracks in their empire were spreading. Species that had long suffered under their rule began to take notice. Rebellions that had once been little more than dying embers reignited into full-fledged uprisings. Entire planets that had once cowered under the warlords' banner now whispered of defiance. It started small. Isolated skirmishes. Insurgent cells launching hit-and-run attacks on warlord supply lines. Then, as the stories spread, so did the unrest. The warlords, already stretched thin hunting Cain, now found themselves fighting wars on multiple fronts. They had ruled through fear, but fear was only effective if no one fought back. And now, they were fighting back. Cain hadn't intended to start a revolution. He had no grand cause, no dream of freedom for the galaxy. His war had always been personal. But now, whether he liked it or not, he had become something larger than himself. The hunted had become the spark that ignited a galaxy-wide inferno. That was when Kor came to him with a plan, one that would end the warlords once and for all. Varkis, the supreme warlord, was the key to everything. The warlords were powerful, but without him, they would fracture. He was the unifying force that held them together, the strategic mind that had orchestrated their rise to dominance. If he fell, their empire would collapse under its own weight. But Varkis was more than just a leader. He was a fortress, a warlord so powerful that no one had ever dared to challenge him directly. His stronghold was said to be impenetrable, a floating monolith hidden deep within warlord-controlled space, protected by the most advanced defenses ever created. Cain didn't care. No fortress was unbreakable. He and Kor spent weeks planning the infiltration, gathering intelligence from every source they could find. Every warlord had their weaknesses. Varkis was no exception. He had become complacent, relying too much on his technology and security systems, believing himself untouchable. Cain would prove him wrong. The night of the mission, Cain moved like a shadow through the stronghold's outer defenses, bypassing security drones and automated turrets with practiced ease. Kor had done his part, feeding false data into the fortress's sensors, making it seem as if nothing was out of the ordinary. As Cain reached the inner sanctum, he found himself standing before something he hadn't expected, something that changed everything. Deep within the stronghold, hidden away from the eyes of the galaxy, was the truth. The warlords were not the masters of their own empire. They never had been. Suspended in massive containment chambers were figures unlike anything Cain had ever seen. Ancient beings, their forms obscured by machinery, pulsating with an eerie, unnatural energy. They weren't warlords. They weren't even soldiers. They were the ones controlling everything. The warlords, for all their power, had only ever been pawns, enforcers carrying out the will of something far older, far more dangerous. The real rulers of the galaxy had been operating from the shadows all along, using the warlords as a front while they remained unseen, manipulating events from behind the curtain. Cain realized, in that moment, that his war had been far smaller than he had ever imagined. Killing Varkis would shatter the warlords, but it wouldn't end the true threat. He had been fighting the wrong enemy. Now, he had to decide, did he finish what he had started, or did he chase the deeper truth? Cain had spent years hunting warlords. Now, he was about to go to war with something far worse. The warlords had built their empire on the illusion of power, on the belief that they were the ultimate force in the galaxy. That illusion had been shattered. The death of their leaders, the crumbling of their control, and the fear of a single, unseen assassin had unraveled everything they had spent centuries creating. But the warlords, for all their arrogance, were not the true enemy. Cain had seen the truth, and the truth had changed everything. The real rulers of the galaxy, the unseen forces that had controlled the warlords from the shadows, were something far older, something far worse. They were beings of incomprehensible intelligence, their presence woven into the very structure of warlord society. They had shaped history, engineered conflicts, and manipulated entire civilizations for their own purposes. And now, for the first time, they had been exposed. Cain knew that killing Varkis was still necessary. The Supreme Warlord was the last piece holding the Warlords together, the figurehead that prevented their complete collapse. But now, the mission was more than just revenge. It was about cutting off the Warlords at the root so that Cain could go after the true threat. Varkis was no fool. He had watched as his empire crumbled, as his fellow Warlords fell one by one. He had adapted, reinforced his defenses, and prepared for the inevitable confrontation. His stronghold was now a fortress in the purest sense, layers upon layers of impenetrable security, automated war machines guarding every entrance, and an army of genetically enhanced warriors bred for the sole purpose of protecting their master. Cain didn't care. He had come too far to turn back. The battle for the stronghold was unlike anything he had ever faced. Cain and Kor had planned for every possibility, but even their best strategies were barely enough against Varkis' overwhelming firepower. The fortress was a death trap, with corridors collapsing behind them, energy turrets firing relentlessly, and warlord warriors engaging them at every turn. Cain fought with everything he had, moving like a specter through the chaos, striking fast and disappearing before the enemy could react. His blade carved through armor, his stolen warlord weaponry turning their own technology against them. But the cost was high. Kor was wounded early in the assault, his knowledge of tactics keeping them alive but his body failing him with every step. And then, at the heart of the stronghold, Cain came face to face with the Supreme Warlord himself. Varkis was nothing like the others. He was a towering figure of brute force and calculated intellect, a being who had ruled not through fear alone, but through sheer dominance. His armor was more than just plating, it was an extension of his own mind, linked to the very structure of the fortress itself. Every weapon, every system, every defense, he controlled it all. The fight was brutal. Cain had fought warlords before, but none like this. Varkis anticipated his every move, countered every attack. Cain was faster, but Varkis was stronger. He was smarter. Every strike Cain landed was absorbed by the warlord's adaptive armor, every evasive maneuver met with a counter so precise it was almost inhuman. Cain was losing. Then, Kor made his final move. With the last of his strength, Kor accessed the stronghold's core systems, overloading the energy grid. The fortress began to collapse around them, alarms blaring as walls cracked and flames erupted from the floors. Varkis hesitated for only a fraction of a second. Cain took his chance. With one final, brutal strike, he drove his plasma blade into the warlord's chest, piercing through layers of armor and cybernetic enhancements. Varkis staggered, eyes burning with disbelief. Then, with a final growl of defiance, the Supreme Warlord fell. Cain barely made it out as the fortress collapsed. Kor didn't. His last words had been simple. End this. The warlords were finished. Without Varkis, the remaining factions turned on each other, their once unified empire dissolving into infighting and chaos. The war that had seemed unwinnable only years ago was now over. But Cain knew his fight wasn't. He had uncovered something far bigger than the warlords, something ancient, something that had been manipulating events for longer than he could comprehend. He had seen them, deep within Varkis' stronghold, trapped in containment chambers yet still powerful enough to control an empire. They were still out there. Watching. Waiting. Cain had destroyed the warlords. Now, he had to destroy the ones who had made them. The galaxy believed the assassin had vanished. The whispers of his name faded into myth. But in the darkest corners of space, Cain prepared for the battle that no one else even knew existed. The war was not over. It had only just begun.